Good afternoon, everyone. I should preface this talk, because it's quite a controversial subject, by saying that reducing carbon dioxide levels should be our absolute priority in tackling climate change. But this is just an idea to get you talking and discussing about other things, I guess. Thanks. So as we heard this morning, climate change is one of the major challenges facing both Australia and the global community in the near future. This is a story of a particular type of technology that's been proposed as a means to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. So in 1991, Mt Pinatubo erupted, and it sent millions of tons of ash and other particles into the atmosphere. One of these particles, sulfur dioxide, travelled upwards to a height of 20 kilometres, where it spread out around the globe, and it produced a global cooling effect of about 0.5 degrees over the next 12 to 18 months. So although Pinatubo was located in the Philippines, the particles spread first around the equator, and then with the global wind distribution, they also spread towards the poles, producing quite an even, but not completely even, cooling effect. There's an idea that we could mimic this natural phenomenon by artificially injecting reflective particles into the atmosphere. And this is one of a range of technologies known as climate engineering. I was working on a project on the feasibility of a climate engineering technology, looking at the engineering aspect of it. And we were proposing that we could use a helium-filled balloon and a 20-kilometre pipe, that these particles could be pumped up and sprayed out. But we were particularly concerned with how this balloon and the pipe would move around in different wind speeds. And so we thought, well, apart from doing computer models to try and predict the behaviour, we could try and validate it using a small-scale test. So what would this involve? A 20-metre helium-filled balloon, a 1-kilometre hydraulic hose. We could pump some water up the hose, and then with cameras, we could see how it behaved in different winds and compare that data to our computer models. This is our balloon. It's quite a standard one used over sports stadiums. We found a very isolated and windy airfield, which should have given us good results. But we were also asked, because of the nature of the project, to consider some other aspects apart from just the engineering and science of it. First, we had to get approval from the ethics committees of the universities involved. And because it wasn't tested on animals or humans, and it wasn't involving any harmful chemicals, it was very quickly granted ethics approval. But it's a very controversial topic. And so our funders also asked us, well, can you go and talk to the public about this and see what they think about it? So a number of public discussion groups were convened around the UK. And we talked about climate engineering in general, and we also talked about this test in particular. And the findings were really, really interesting. This is because a lot of the participants agreed that they didn't really have an aversion to the test itself. They could see that it had no environmental risk, and if it was conducted safely, it was a logical kind of thing to do. But they really weren't sure about climate engineering technology and how this research would lead to the deployment of climate engineering technology. This is what's called the slippery slope argument. It's an idea that an initial decision can lead to further development of a technology without any kind of stopgap in the middle. So what can we say are the stages of development for a climate engineering technology? Well, you can start with computer models, and most people agree that this is relatively benign. It's a scientist sitting in their office seeing what will happen. A bit like predicting the weather, we were doing it on a much bigger scale, trying to produce climate change around the world. The next stage of scaling upwards might involve some laboratory tests. So in our particular research, we were looking at different types of particles and how reflective they were. And we were also measuring things like the strength of the fibres that you could use to build a 20-kilometre long balloon tether. The next stage of scaling upwards would involve a small-scale test of the technology. And this is really where our balloon experiment came in. It wasn't an exact test of the technology because it didn't involve any climate-changing chemicals, but it was more testing the infrastructure that you'd need to deliver these particles. And then finally, having completed all of these stages, the last stage of technology development would be a large-scale trial. where you would go and build your full-scale infrastructure and you'd change the climate, try and measure it, and then scale it completely upwards to a whole Earth system. So one of the things the public discussion groups and us as researchers were quite interested in was what's the regulation surrounding this upscaling? Where are the stopgaps located? Well, actually, there's very little regulation on an international and national scale for climate engineering. There is some relating to protecting biodiversity, which can be interpreted as a kind of moratorium on end-scale deployment. And so a lot of people have been proposing that we need more regulation. And one way that we could do this would be divide it into indoor and outdoors. So it's okay to do things indoors, like computer models and lab experiments, but it's not okay to do things outdoors. So what happened to our experiment? Well, because of a lot of the uncertainty regarding the regulation, and also other issues such as IP and how it relates to climate engineering technology, the test was first put on hold while we had more discussion with public groups, the public and with interest groups. And then eventually the researchers themselves decided that it would be an unnecessary escalation to go ahead and do this experiment. So we focused on computer models and lab tests, and we got some really good results out of that during the 4.5-year study. So I just wanted to give this as an example of a story, as we've been talking about this morning. And it's a story that doesn't just involve science and engineering. It's a story that involves many different fields. And I think it's one of the strengths of the Monash Foundation is that we bring together people from all of these fields and we can talk about these issues in an interdisciplinary way. So how can this technology benefit Australia? Well, unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet to the problem of climate change. It would only tackle the global warming effect. It wouldn't actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so a lot of the problems that we're seeing in Australia, particularly the bleaching of the coral reefs due to ocean acidification, would still happen even if we were to implement this kind of technology. Thank you.